Boldwood presents The Pit Girl, written by Lynette Rees and read by Deryn Edwards. For the villagers of Abercannide, Merthyr Tydfil, who suffered two tragic pit disasters in 1862 and 1865 respectively. Chapter 1. Abercannide, Merthyr Tydfil, 1866. 13-year-old Mary Evans's head rebounded as she felt a sharp crack against her cheek when her father struck her yet again, her hand flying to her face in a desperate act of self-protection. Her only crime had been in allowing the fire in the hearth to go out when he was due home from the pub that night, which was a bitterly cold one at that. He did not even give her the chance to explain the reason she'd not fed the ferocious beast that required constant attention, because Mum had sent her to fetch Dr. Pritchard to her poorly brother. The doctor had moved house recently and was now living in Troydru, a neighbouring village, which was a fair walk away. Mum had stayed by Tom's side as she'd wiped his fevered brow with a cold, wet cloth and tried to keep him awake. It had all happened after Gwynfor Evans had set off for the pub when Tom had taken sick. The day before he'd been playing near the River Taff. Some claimed the new sickness sweeping through the valley was waterborne, so those living near the canal and rivers were more at risk. It had already claimed 30 or more lives in the town, so her mother was particularly concerned that her youngest son be seen by the doctor as soon as possible. But Dr. Pritchard hadn't been at his home when Mary arrived, as he'd been out tending to some other patients in the community. So, with bated breath and a silver shilling in her sweaty palm, she'd waited anxiously as the seconds ticked by. Finally, she found her voice. But, Dad, she said, as tears blurred her eyes. The reason the fire is out is because I had to run and fetch the doctor to see our Tommy. Her father, who appeared contrite now, seemed to suddenly sober up, his eyes widening.
Tommy? Well, what's the matter with him? Why didn't you come to the pub to fetch me?
There was no mistaking that Tommy was her father's favourite child, and the mere mention of his name was enough to soften her father's heart. Mary shook her head. There was no time. Dr. Pritchard was out on house calls when I arrived, so I had to wait. And then finally, only an hour or so ago, he showed up and took me with him in his coach. He only left here about 20 minutes ago, and Mum said it was dark and too late to go to the pub to fetch you. Honestly, she did. Her voice had a pleading tone to it now, and she detested herself for it, hated showing her vulnerability to him. Pushing her roughly out of the way, her father made for the stone staircase, which was hidden behind a small door, making his way to Tommy's bed. She listened through the open door as he chastised her mother for not sending her to fetch him. Then she heard her mother telling him to calm down and keep quiet, as Tommy wasn't well at all. And then all went silent. Not knowing what to do next, Mary did what people often do when uncertain or in times of trouble. She boiled the kettle. First, she filled it with clean water from the pump in the yard outside, and then, remembering the fire had almost gone out, realised in her haste that she needed to stoke it up with the poker to get some air into it, and then build it up again with screwed-up balls of newspaper and lumps of coal, before drawing it up with the metal blower. Finally, with the fire rescued, she could place the kettle on top of it. She recalled only last spring when her father had been softer towards her. On a day when the sky was clear blue and the sun high up in the sky, he'd taken her for a walk up the mountain, way past the pit where he worked as a coal miner. It was a blot on the landscape, that black, grimy place, with the constant cranking of the pit wheel. They had climbed for what seemed a long time through woodland and jumped over a babbling brook, where her father had given her his hand to help her to the other side, for fear she should fall on the slippery embankment. He had been tender towards her then, and in high spirits too, as he sang songs he remembered from his youth. Then afterwards, there'd been a small hillock to ascend, and just when Mary had felt she couldn't climb much higher as she was out of puff, there on top of it was a large concentration of the most glorious golden daffodils she'd ever seen, bowing their heads in the breeze. Her breath had hitched in her chest to see such a sight. Beyond the daffodils was a pond, encircled by trees and teeming with wildlife, dragonflies, birds of various types, and, under the water, tadpoles and small fish. It was a world away from the valley below. Her mother had once said that her father was scarred like the valley itself. Mary had seen those blue scars for herself, where the black coal dust had mingled with the wounds of his hard labour. Those blue marks were battle scars that all miners succumb to at some time or another, and they were with them for life ever after. It was some time before Mam appeared downstairs, and when she did, it startled Mary from her reflection of times gone by. She studied her mother's weary-looking face for a moment. There was a sadness in her eyes that she'd not seen before. "It's coming for us," was all she managed to say. Mary had no idea who or what she meant, so, frowning for a moment, she asked, "Who's coming for us, Mum?" "The sickness," her mother said, as she stared at some point in the distance. Mary had heard of the sickness that had been sweeping the valley of late and claiming many lives. It was as if her mother was afraid to even say the name cholera, for fear it should infect them. Stepping forward, Mary laid her hand on her mother's forearm. "Ma'am," she said softly, "the doctor told us he didn't think it was that particular sickness. Shall I make a cup of tea?" "Well, if it's not that sickness, then what on earth is it? Tommy was out playing all day, and I've just found out from Mrs. Griffiths in number 6 that he was with her Alfie and some other boys. They were playing on the banks of the River Taff. It must be the sickness." Mary shook her head. "No, Dr. Pritchard says he thinks it's a mild stomach upset and not to feed him anything for now, to starve him for a full day and night and only to give him cool, previously boiled water." She remembered the doctor stressing that now cholera had hit the town, they all needed to keep their hands clean by washing them more often. Her mother raised her head and, fixing her gaze on her, said, "I suppose the doctor must know what he's talking about." "Yes, of course, Ma'am. Take a seat by the table and I'll brew that tea. What about Dad? Do you think he'll want any?" Her mother shook her head. "No, he's full of the ale, and he said he'll sleep in the boys' room tonight." 10-year-old Tommy shared his room with his older brother Bryn. He was a collier at the nearby coal pit like their father. Bryn had gone underground at the age of 12 and was now 16 years old. Mary herself shared a bedroom with her younger sister, Neris. The third, larger bedroom was shared by her parents. There were times when it was late at night, or maybe in the early hours of the morning, when she'd hear her father come in from the pub and hushed voices in her parents' bedroom. It sounded to her as if her mother was sometimes protesting about something, but she wasn't quite sure what. Dad's drinking, maybe. Then, after a few minutes, there would be the inevitable sounds of the bed's mattress squeaking rhythmically against its springs. She was never quite sure what was going on there, but it never went on for too long, and then she'd hear a loud groan coming from her father through the bedroom wall, and the next thing she knew, he was snoring very loudly. Usually in the morning, her mother came down to breakfast with a worried expression on her face. Mary had once plucked up the courage to ask Bryn what was going on and why Mam sometimes looked so concerned in the mornings. Bryn had pursed his lips disapprovingly, as though forcing himself not to say anything, But then, as he had a good sense of humour, had just thrown back his head and, laughing, had said, "It's grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about, Mary. It's probably because Mam doesn't want to have any more babies at her age, and Dad, when he comes home from the pub, gets a bit fruity, shall we say." Mary had no idea what her brother meant by fruity, but for the time being, she accepted his explanation. She could well understand why her mother might not want any more children. Life was hard enough for them as it was. Even though Dad worked at the pit, he seemed to spend a lot of his time and wages on alcohol at the pub. If it wasn't for Bryn, then they might well have starved for what their father contributed towards the family coffers. Tonight, her brother was working a night shift at the pit, and she was grateful her father was sleeping in Tommy's room, but she was understandably concerned he might drift off into a deep slumber after all that ale he'd supped, and not hear if Tommy was ill during the night. Still, her mother would get more rest with her father not being in the marital bed. That was, if she could sleep. The following morning there was no sign of Dad, but her mother looked a lot happier as she sliced a loaf of bread and began to butter the slices. Bryn was due home at any moment following his night shift. Her mother smiled when she saw Mary approach. "Seems the doctor was right. Tommy's feeling a lot better this morning," she said, smiling. "He's even asking for something to eat." Remembering what Dr. Pritchard had told them, Mary bit on her bottom lip. "Best not to give him any food like the doctor said, ma'am. Just cool boiled water. Food might make him ill again." Her mother's cheeks flushed. "Oh, I clean forgot. I just took him up a plate of toast and a cup of tea." She made to go upstairs, but Mary, realising she'd be quicker, said, "I'll go." She ran as fast as her legs would carry her to her brother's room as he was about to tuck into a slice of hot, buttery toast. Snatching it from his grasp, she asked, "How many slices did Mam give you?" "Only this one." He blinked. "Well, I'm sorry, you can't have it. Have you touched your cup of tea yet?" He shook his head. "But why not?" His eyes looked large with sunken dark shadows beneath them. "Because the doctor said you're not to eat or drink anything other than plain water for a full day, and the water must be boiled and all." His eyes were brimming with tears now, so she sat on the bed beside him and put a comforting arm around his shoulders. "Look, you don't want to go chucking up again like you did yesterday, do you?" He shook his head. "Just have some patience," she said kindly. "I know you're thirsty, so I'll fetch you that water. I'll have to wait for it to cool, though." He nodded and forced a smile. "Why does it have to be boiled, Mary?" "Because of that new sickness that's going around. The doctor doesn't think you have it, but they're warning people to keep clean and only drink boiled water." She wished she didn't have to explain this to him, and felt bad he wasn't able to eat normally. But realising the importance of the doctor's words, she wanted to stick to her guns. Mam seemed so half-soaked these days, unaware somehow of what was going on around her. Even when Dad struck Mary like he had last night, her mother seemed not to take in what was going on. She so wished she had the sort of mother who would stand up to her father. He was taking liberties in all manner of ways these days, staying out late at the pub, being handy with the odd slap or two in her direction, even taking liberties with their mother by the sound of it. Only once had he ever been challenged about striking Mary, and that was when Bryn had come in from a night shift unexpectedly and caught him forcibly shaking her by the shoulders as she'd somehow managed to burn the toast. Mostly, he was a clever bugger, doing things like that to her when no one else was around to see it. The strange thing was, he never touched Tommy or Neris, and he wouldn't have dared try it on with Bryn either, as these days he was as tall as him. So why did it have to be her? Why was she the scapegoat of the family? Her life had become a misery of late, so she tended to try and stay out of his way, And to make matters worse, there was evidence that she was turning into a young woman. She had begun to develop breasts, and her mother had told her it wouldn't be too long until she received her monthly bleeds. That was something she wasn't looking forward to, as according to a girl she knew, Mattie Connor, it was then that you could get pregnant. So she was going to have to stay away from boys at all costs. Not that she had much time for them, as she was either busy helping Mam around the house or had her head in a book. Life, though, in general, was becoming miserable for her, the way her parents were behaving lately. It was while Mary was out walking in the village, with her wicker shopping basket over the crook of her arm, that she heard some women gossiping on the doorstep of one of the small huddle of houses. She was about to turn the corner and head towards the shop when she heard her father's name mentioned. The women hadn't noticed her approach, and she had her shawl wrapped around her head. They were so engrossed in conversation that they weren't aware who was around them.
"Course, Gwynfor Evans has been knocking that Blodwyn off for a long time,"
the woman with the hooked nose and dark hair was saying, arms folded and her lips pursed in a disapproving fashion. Her appearance reminded Mary of a witch she'd once seen in a storybook she'd read to her brother and sister. There was a brazen, hard look to the woman that Mary didn't much care for. Blodwyn? Who on earth was she? And what did the term knocking off mean? It was a new one on her. But then as the conversation continued, it became increasingly obvious what those women meant. The lady with the red hair, who was shorter than her companion, had dark brown, beady-looking eyes, reminding Mary of a little bird pecking on crumbs as her head nodded back and forth as she'd been listening.
"Yes," she'd said, "Blodwyn has got the brass neck to have him under her roof while he has a wife and family in Upper Abercynaid. Poor dabs, those kids. Imagine them having a father like that."
Mary's mouth gaped open in horror at what the women were saying, and she snapped it shut again. Surely Mam and Bryn knew nothing of this, and the two younger children most definitely didn't. The conversation then switched to a different topic, something about the weather, and was there any chance of rain today, as Mrs. Bird had just pegged out a line full of washing. Mary, feeling disconcerted now, dashed quickly around the corner out of sight, as she did not want them to see or recognise her. Panting, she stood with her back against the stone wall of the end house, taking deep breaths to compose herself. A few minutes ago, life had seemed as it always had for her, mundane and monotonous. Yet, within a short space of time, those women's words had cut through her like a knife, making her question her very existence. It all seemed a lie. She already disliked her father. It was the way he'd changed lately, becoming aggressive in drink. But now, she hated him with a vengeance. She had the urge to rush home and blurt out everything to her mother, then wake up her brother, who would be sleeping after his night shift, and do the same thing, demanding to know if what those women had said was true. But her mother was relying on her to fetch some provisions from the shop. She'd sent Mary out to bring home a loaf of bread, a hunk of cheese and some eggs. She'd also thought to purchase a poke of boiled sweets for Tommy, which she'd give him when it was safe for him to eat again, to make up for snatching his breakfast away. Now she felt unable to concentrate, her mind racing a mile a minute to process what she'd just heard. Her father was having a dalliance with a woman called Blodwyn. Is that why he was drinking so much lately, trying in some sense to blot out his sins from his mind? She barely remembered entering the shop, even unaware of the tinkle of the small bell above the door as her thoughts drowned it out. It was almost as though the real Mary was someplace else, and now she was an observer. It was busy, as Mrs. Jones was handing over several packages to a woman at the counter, who then placed them in her basket, while 3 other women waited patiently in the queue. Mary did not feel patient, though. She wanted all the women out of there, so it was just her and kindly Mrs. Jones, who'd smile at her and utter some comforting words. But now she had the humiliation of waiting at the end of the queue, all the while wondering if any of those women knew about her father and this so-called Blodwyn he'd taken up with. Finally, though, the queue dwindled, and she was left facing Mrs. Jones. Gladys Jones was an elderly woman with pure white hair and a welcoming smile. Her cornflower blue eyes illuminated warmly as she addressed Mary.
"Well, hello there, stranger. I've not seen you for some time. How have you been keeping, Cariad?" she said in her sing-song tone of voice.
Mary didn't know if she could bear anyone being so nice to her right now, as tears weren't far from the surface. She swallowed hard as she tried to fight them off, but there was no fooling the elderly woman.
"What is it, Bach?"
I... To Mary's horror, huge, shuddering sobs engulfed her body. It was as if the upset of yesterday, with rushing to fetch the doctor for her brother, her father slapping her across the face, and now hearing gossip from those women, had all come to a head. When she was unable to reply, Mrs. Jones lowered her voice and spoke softly.
"Now, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm having a quiet period and could do with a break, so I'll just turn the sign to closed on the shop door, and we'll retire to the back and have ourselves a cup of tea. Or you can have some of my homemade lemonade if you prefer. How's that suit?"
Mary thought it suited very well, and she managed a nod of appreciation, but the lump that had been growing in her throat was making it hard to speak. The elderly woman sprang into action as she came scurrying from behind the counter, crossed the shop floor, flipped the sign on the glass panel of the door, and slid the bolt across it.
"There, we shan't be disturbed," she said, as she made her way back over to where Mary was standing. "Come through to the back room with me."
Mary didn't need asking twice, and she followed the woman past the shop counter, through a small door into the back room. The room was more of a storage place. Several sacks of flour and potatoes were stacked up on the floor, and a multitude of tins of food lined various shelves. Mary could see from the labels they were tinned fruit and meat, and beside those were jars of preserves, pickles and jams. Near the window was a small table with 2 wooden chairs.
"Now you sit yourself down, dearie, while I put the kettle on to boil."
She placed the old blackened sooty kettle on top of the fire in the hearth.
"It won't take a tick, as I'd previously boiled it ready to have a brew when that sudden flurry of customers arrived." She chuckled. "It's always the same thing around here, all or nothing."
Mary felt she'd have preferred the lemonade, but was too proud to say so. Yet, as if reading her thoughts, the woman turned towards her and said,
"Oh, I did mention lemonade to you, didn't I?"
Mary smiled and nodded. "Yes, please," she answered, finding her voice for the first time.
"Then the lemonade you shall have."
She headed off to the pantry, where she drew out an earthenware jug and poured the cloudy mixture into a glass.
"Only made it yesterday, so it's quite fresh. Been in the pantry all this time to keep cool. Take a seat, dear."
Mary did as told, and after placing her basket on the table, she drew out a chair and sat. Then Mrs. Jones handed her the glass, and she went off to brew a cuppa for herself. The kettle on the fire was now puffing out clouds of steam. Mary closed her eyes after taking a sip of the cool, refreshing liquid. It did taste good and all. Mam had tried making lemonade once, but it wasn't as nice as Mrs. Jones's. Mam's had tasted a bit sour, but this version had the right amount of sweetness. You could still taste the lemonade, but it didn't make you wince. Mrs. Jones was a very clever woman, as she sometimes sold her lemonade and ginger beer in the summer months to folk. She also occasionally baked and sold slabs of barabrith and miniature sponge cakes, which went down a treat with customers.
"I asked if the lemonade is all right for you, Mary,"
Mrs. Jones was saying now, as she tilted her head to one side with concern. Oh dear. Mary hadn't realised the woman had been asking her a question. She'd been absorbed in her own thoughts and didn't wish to appear rude.
Yes, it's lovely, Mrs. Jones. Thank you.
That's good to hear, Cariad. You can have another glass when you finish that, if you like.
Mary nodded gratefully. Mrs. Jones carried her cup of tea over to the table, and drawing out a chair, she sat opposite Mary.
Now then, young lady, why are you looking so upset this morning?
Mary explained all that had gone on since yesterday with her brother and the doctor being summoned, and what she'd overheard before calling to the shop, though she didn't mention that her father had slapped her hard across the face last night. Mrs. Jones frowned, her blue eyes clouding over so they now appeared almost grey.
To be truthful, she said,
her fingers circling the rim of her teacup, as though giving her something to concentrate on,
there has been some gossip amongst folk in the village. I don't hold with gossip myself, and quite often I'll straighten someone out if they say something I know is untrue or spiteful, just to spread things around. There are some in this village who are gleeful about putting others down, but not me.
I realise that,
said Mary. She'd known the woman a long time, and Mrs. Jones had only ever exhibited kindness towards her.
But in the case of your father and that Blodwyn one, I have to say there is no smoke without fire. They've been spotted together on several occasions, and there was one time when I was walking on the canal bank. I spotted them speaking with one another outside the pub. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. A man and woman don't have to be in that sort of a relationship to make small talk with one another. Inquire how the other is, that kind of thing. But, she bit her bottom lip, in that case, your father put his arm around her and ushered her inside the pub. My guess is he didn't want folk to see them together. Oh, those men in company with one another supping ale would rather keep quiet than tell their wives what one of them is up to. It's an unspoken agreement amongst such men. But a pub is no place for a good God-fearing woman. It shows what women of her ilk are up to. Mary had no idea what the word ilk meant, but she could guess Mrs. Jones meant her sort. And just what sort was this Blodwyn, she wanted to know. Mary herself didn't know of any women who frequented pubs or hung around with married men. Now, I know it's a lot for you to take in, Mary, and I wouldn't be telling you any of this. But since you've heard the gossip, it's better that you know. But I don't know whether you should tell your mother. It might upset her. Though, then again, she might hear from someone else anyhow. I'll leave it up to you. Oh dear, what a dilemma. Mary's first thought had been to tell her mother what she'd heard, but she didn't know what to do. She thought by telling Mam she'd quash any rumours, but now, after what Mrs. Jones had just said, it sounded as though the rumours were true.
I just don't know what to do, Mrs. Jones, she said.
Then she took a few sips from her glass, draining it and setting it down on the table. Then perhaps do nothing for now, suggested Mrs. Jones. That's if you don't feel right about it.
I could mention it to my brother to see if he's heard anything, but then again, he's so big and strong these days, he might thump our father.
Yes, that brother of yours has grown up a lot lately. Being a hewer at the pit has made him muscular and strong like that. I really don't know what to suggest to you, as anything you say might cause trouble one way or another. Though from what I can see, your father has brought trouble on himself recently. Mary had to agree the woman was right. It was all beginning to make sense now, with her father being missing so much from the family home of late. He'd kept some very tardy hours, and one night he'd not returned home at all,
claiming when confronted by her mother the following morning that he'd slept in Geraint Harris's house. Geraint had a farm on the hill overlooking the village. Mary remembered thinking at the time, even if her father had supped a lot of ale, it would be easier for him to walk home to his own house than up the ruddy mountain in the dark. It had been raining that night too, so slipping was a possibility. No, her father had been lying. She was sure of it. "Now, let me fetch you another glass of that lemonade," said Mrs. Jones. "I've got a tin of freshly baked Welsh cakes in the cupboard. We'll have a couple of those too." Mary didn't feel like eating, but realised it might do her good, as she hadn't consumed much that morning. In fact, it had been a strange 24 hours altogether, and she'd be relieved when the day was finally over. Chapter 2. When Mary arrived home, all was peaceful in the house. She laid down her wicker basket on the scullery table, wondering where Mum was. A loud snoring noise emanated from above. She often wondered if Bryn disturbed Tommy when he came home from a night shift, as they shared a room. Wondering where her younger brother was right now, she peeped into her bedroom to see him sitting up in the bed she shared with Nerys, reading a book. He must have crept in there after she'd left the house. A big smile broke out on his face as soon as he saw her. He'd probably escaped there to get away from the snoring in the room next door.
"Hello, Mary,"
he yelled. "Shh," she said, placing her index finger to her lips, while she hid the other hand behind her back. Tommy's eyes enlarged.
"What have you got there, then?" he whispered.
"I decided not to fetch you any boiled sweets after all," she said, shaking her head with a solemn expression on her face as she wagged a finger at him. His face crumpled, but then she said,
"But I have brought you these instead."
That was enough to perk up his spirits as he leapt out of bed and tried to wrestle the paper bag of sweets out of her hands. Smiling, she handed it over to him.
"Well, there's a difference to yesterday. You look as fit as a flea today." "What sweets did you fetch me, Mary?"
"Sherbet bonbons."
He smiled. "My favourite." "Yes, I know. Now, if I were you, I'd make the most of reading a book in bed with a bag of sweets. As soon as Mam sees you back to normal, she'll have you downstairs helping with the chores. Where is she, by the way?" "Not sure. Think she's gone somewhere with Nerys," he said. And then he popped a bonbon into his mouth and closed his eyes to savour it.
It was right enough. He wouldn't get to lie about in bed much longer. Though Dad, if he came home, would mollycoddle him for sure. It was strange how her father favoured Tommy over all the others in the family. She often wondered why that was. Mary left her brother to his own devices and returned to the scullery to unpack the provisions from her basket. Her concern for him had been the reason she'd gone upstairs to see him immediately. Thankfully, his health appeared to have been restored, but there'd been no messing around by the river for him while the sickness was on the rampage. It was far too risky. The doctor had explained that years ago it was thought cholera was an airborne disease, but now it was known to be carried in the water. Apparently, there'd been some water pump in London that had originally caused the first outbreak. All of this made Mary concerned that the communal pump they used might spread the disease too, but the doctor had explained how something had got into that water system, and anyway, there was far more overcrowding in London. Dr. Pritchard had gone on to explain that although there were some cholera cases now cropping up in Merthyr, the population of Merthyr Tydfil had swelled over the years as people came to work in its ironworks, travelling near and far, and some even arrived from overseas. Abercannide might be more fortunate, as the area wasn't as overcrowded as some other parts of the town. Mam had told her there'd been a particularly nasty outbreak of the disease some years ago, prompting the building of a special graveyard near the St. Tydfil's workhouse. She supposed some of the deaths would have arisen from the workhouse itself. Where on earth were Mam and Nerys, though? It wasn't like her mother to have left the house for so long at this time of the day. Dad had departed early this morning too, which was odd, as his shift didn't begin until the afternoon. It was highly unusual for him to act in such a manner, and she experienced an unsettling sensation in her stomach, suggesting that something was amiss. Mary busied herself, tidying the small abode, picking up her brother's discarded heavy work boots. Steel-capped and with several segs in their soles, they made a heck of a noise when he crossed the cobbles with those on his feet. They were necessary wear for underground work, though, where falls of coal could sometimes happen or crush accidents from drams carrying coal. She sighed as she placed the boots in the cupboard under the stairs. She knew how exhausted her brother was. He could barely keep his eyes open after swilling off the coal dust in the old tin bath in the backyard, with water filled from the pump, topped up with hot water from several boiled pans from the stove. The coal miners rarely washed their backs, as it was thought to weaken the man, so it only got a good scrub if they had a couple of days off work or were going somewhere like on a date with a special sweetheart. Mam thought it a silly old wives' tale, but tale or not, the colliers in the area were so superstitious they felt it might cause some ill to befall them. But Mary thought there might be something in that old wives' tale. Only last Christmas there'd been an explosion at the pit where 34 men and boys had lost their lives. The village hadn't fully recovered from that, and everyone knew someone involved in that accident. People had lost fathers, husbands, sons, grandsons, and other relatives, along with good friends. And some of those who hadn't lost their lives had bad injuries that prevented them from ever working again. Mam always insisted on giving her brother a good breakfast before his head hit his pillow to sleep. Usually it was a couple of rashers of thick bacon with fried eggs and bread and butter, all washed down with a couple of cups of strong tea. She maintained that a working man needed more fuel than most, and Bryn was grateful for it too. Of course, she'd been doing the same thing for their father for years. Mary continued tidying up the place and dusting around. The coal fire created a lot of dirty grime that landed on surfaces, but it was easily solved with a quick wipe from a damp cloth. Then she swilled out some dirty laundry discarded in the corner of the scullery, pegging it out on the washing line to dry. She wasn't as thorough as Mam was when it came to the washing, and her mother might chastise her later for leaving stains embedded in the clothing, but in any case, she hoped she'd be pleased with her efforts. Any work she could do for her mother would ease her burden later. She worked so hard for her family and deserved a rest. A thud from above told her that her elder brother had awoken from his slumber. She could tell by the heavy sounds above that it was Bryn and not Tommy, who was much lighter on his feet. No wonder people worried about him. He was small for his age and light as a feather. The scullery door opened, and Bryn stood there blinking, his hair dishevelled as he yawned. His eyes were black-lined from coal dust, despite washing earlier. When Mam was around, she usually insisted they each took a clean, wet flannel to wash thoroughly around their eyes after a shift, saying that eyes were precious things and they didn't want to lose their sight like some of those pit ponies. But even the ponies were blinkered, and the men were not, so getting coal dust into their eyes wasn't a good thing at all.
"Hello, Mary. Where's our Mam?"
Bryn asked, his voice low and husky.
I'm not sure. She sent me to the shop earlier on an errand, and when I returned, she and Nerys weren't here. Tommy thinks they've gone somewhere together.
"Maybe,"
he said, smiling. And then he glanced at the brown earthenware teapot on the pine table.
Would you like a cup of tea? She offered.
"Aye, I would and all. Funny how you can read my mind, Mary," he chuckled. "Hey, I heard about what happened with Tommy yesterday. That was a bit of a set to, wasn't it?"
She nodded as she poured him a cup of tea from the pot, then refilled her own cup.
He seems fine, though, now. Bouncing around on the bed he was when I returned from the shop with some sweets for him. I had to tell him to pipe down in case he woke you.
Aye, well, that's good to hear, when you realised what the alternative might have been.
Bryn drew out a chair and sat by the table. He propped his head on his hand, supported by his elbow, still clearly exhausted. He worked hard, and any sleep he could get was precious to him.
You're looking tired today,
he said as he studied her face. She took a seat opposite him and explained what had happened with their father slapping her hard across the face.
A bloody beast,
yelled Bryn.
Someone needs to teach that brute a lesson. The way he treats you is atrocious.
It's worse than that, Bryn. I heard a rumour just this morning about him.
Her brother's eyes were wide and unblinking now. Then they narrowed to almost slits as he asked,
Rumour? What bloody rumour?
Mary swallowed hard, realising things would never be the same again once she told him what she'd overheard.
I was walking to the shop when I heard these two women talking about him on the doorstep. They reckoned he's seeing a woman by the name of Blodwyn.
Bryn half laughed, until he realised his sister was serious about the matter. His face now deadpan, he sat forward in his seat.
Are you sure they were talking about our father, though?
Oh, yes, she nodded. One named him and said he has a wife and kids and is living in Upper Abergannide. It wouldn't be anyone else, as there's only one Gwynfor Evans living here.
Bryn's face paled, and Mary shovelled a couple of spoonfuls of sugar into her brother's cup, as wasn't it supposed to be good for shock? She well understood his rising emotion, as she'd felt the same way not a couple of hours since. Then she noticed how his lips became set in a grim line as he flexed and unflexed his fingers. It was as if he needed to do something with them. Then he bunched both hands into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. If their father came through the door right now, she had no doubts that Bryn would thump him. She could only hope he wouldn't. It was a couple of hours later before Mam returned to the house with Nerys in tow, both seeming weary and worn out. Meanwhile, after convincing Bryn to return to his bed as he needed his sleep before another night shift, Mary sighed a breath of relief. Tommy had risen from his bed now through boredom and was seated at the scullery table with a cup of cool boiled water in front of him. Mary was determined to listen to the doctor's advice, as she didn't want any setbacks for him.
Ma'am,
Mary said gently as her mother approached, her face pale, features drawn. She undid the ribbons of her bonnet and placed it down on the table, and then patted her hair with both hands.
Where have you been all this time?
Mary, catching a glimpse of her sister in her mother's shadow, could sense an expression of confusion on her sister's face. There was somewhere I needed to go, that was all.
We went to see a lady, piped out Nerys. She's living in Pond Row on the canal bank.
Mam's shocked expression said it all. She obviously hadn't expected that from her youngest daughter, probably thinking that Nerys wouldn't mention it, as maybe she'd warned her not to. Feeling brave now, Mary asked,
Is that woman's name Blodwyn by any chance?
Her mother nodded with a deep sadness in her sea-green eyes. But how do you know, Mary? Her mother angled her head to one side in puzzlement. Mary swallowed. This wasn't going to be easy.
It was something I overheard this morning when I was shopping in the village. Two women were speaking about her and...
Your father's name cropped up? Mary nodded.
How long have you known, ma'am?
Oh, I've suspected something for a few months now, but I didn't want to believe the rumours. Mrs. Griffiths, Alfie's mother, called me in for a cup of tea a couple of days ago and told me all she's heard. She took no pleasure in telling me, mind you. Not like others would in these parts. Her eyes widened for a moment. You've not said anything to your brother, I hope? Mary's face suffused with heat. and she bit her lower lip.
Sorry, ma'am. Bryn rose from bed earlier when you were out, so I told him. I had to, as I couldn't believe it myself.
Mam nodded with understanding. I suppose he'd find out eventually anyhow. It's just I don't much fancy having any more strife beneath this roof. Mary thought back to her brother's earlier words and his manner as his hands had formed fists as though he was ready to punch the living daylights out of their father. It all made sense, though, why their mother had seemed in a world of her own yesterday. Poor Mam, having to cope with all of that. What a dreadful shock that must have been for her.
So, did you get to speak to her, to see if the gossip is true? Blodwyn, I mean. Who's Blodwyn?
Tommy appeared every bit as confused as Nerys.
Never you mind, said Mary. Nerys and Tommy, go outside to the yard to play for a few minutes. The fresh air will do you good, Tommy.
When they'd left via the back door of the scullery, banging it behind them, Mam smiled appreciatively. Thank you, Mary. You're old enough to understand a little of what's going on here, but that pair aren't. She drew out a chair to sit at the table, and then rested her head in her hands. After a moment, she raised her head and looked at her daughter. No, Blodwyn wasn't at home when I called at the house, but I did speak to her mother. It's true, all right. All those times your father has been missing from home, he's been there with that floozy. Her mother's a widow woman, see? There's no father in the house, no head of the home. So Blodwyn's taken my husband, your father, into her bed, against her mother's wishes, I might add. The woman doesn't like what's going on under her roof. It's given her only daughter a bad name, and her too for condoning it. She said if her husband was alive, their daughter wouldn't have dared to move her fancy man in. Mary didn't quite understand what her mother meant by Blodwyn taking her father into her bed. Didn't her father always sleep in his own bed with Mam? She thought she'd ask Bryn about that later. He'd know what their Mam meant. Subdued, Mam barely spoke for the rest of the day, and by tea time, when Bryn was due to be